Hello everyone, welcome to the HVG Coffee Afternoon today. I'm Rhiannon, I'm one of the co-hosts today, and you've also got Will there as well, who has done all the setup and technical support for today's session. We're absolutely delighted to run this session today. It's all focused on inclusive recruitment, which from previous conversations we've had in sessions, I know is a really, really hot topic for us all to consider and think about. So we're expecting lots of really fruitful conversation today. So the session is going to be run by our colleague Tamsin Russell. Tamsin is the Workforce Development Officer for the Museums Association. And it's a real coup and privilege to have Tamsin leading the session today. What we're going to be looking at is exploring the drivers for inclusion and what this means for your recruitment and selection process. We'll be looking at a range of hints and tips to extend inclusion and minimise exclusion within an ethical and legal framework. So for anyone who came to the session a few weeks ago where we started to think about ethics, this is a great sort of follow on from that sort of intro conversation. So without further ado, I will hand over to Tamsin. As always, please do use the chat box to pop down any questions or thoughts you have. And between Will and I, we will support Tamsin to pick up on your comments in the chat. So thank you ever so much, Tamsin.
Thank you. So really delighted to be here. So as Rhiannon said, I work at the Museums Association and we've got a real commitment to diversifying the workforce. And whenever I talk about workforce, it is in the broadest sense of the word. So anybody that works, volunteers in or with museums. In terms of the time that we have together, we're going to explore recruitment and selection. And I use those terms in different contexts and we'll talk about some definitions very shortly. But really it is about you having a protected space and time to start thinking about this. I don't anticipate that I'll be sharing rocket science information with any of you. We've got 58 people in this space. You will all have been doing some of this, I guarantee it, if not more. But what I do want to do is enable us to take that time, take that moment to think about what does inclusive recruitment and selection look like? How does it relate to our context? Because all of your institutions are different, all of your local demographics are different. So there are so many variables. So certainly, you know, if there's going to be one take-home message from today, is that no one size fits all. It's very much different levels of different scales and different approaches. My philosophy to inclusion is that it's not difficult. We just need to say we're going to do it and continue doing it. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to cost money. We just need to start moving forward. And so that's also a theme in terms of everything that I'm going to be talking about today. So in the time that we have together, I want this protected time and space to help you start thinking, help you start thinking about measurement, help start thinking about how you might influence, if that's the block for you. And speaking as one of the EDI group from HVG, and there are lots of my other lovely colleagues here, so there's Ben and Caroline, etc. You know, one of the big pieces of feedback we've had from you guys is that it is around that challenge, that influence, the barriers that are stopping you from doing all the things you want to do. So however you use this time, use it productively. So I'm going to start with a poll. So I'm going to launch a poll and I'm going to give you 30 seconds to complete this. So this is just really a poll to get you to begin to think about, with a typing error, your organisation and where you feel they are in terms of current activity. Of course, this is anonymous, so feel free to carry on. A little bit longer. And some of you might be thinking, well, what's the difference between 2 and 3? It's a really subtle difference, but there is a subtle difference. So we've nearly got everybody voting. I'm not going to vote, so I think we're nearly there. 50 seconds. Wonderful. I'm just going to close the poll and share the results. So for me, and I'm going to take a photograph just so it helps my conversation, and we can come back to this later on. But for me, this is encouraging, because actually what we're saying is there's no organisation in terms of its approach to exclusion and inclusion from a volunteering perspective is totally excluding. And we have more mid-table activity than we have bottom table activity. I think the challenge for all of us is around how do we embed that inclusion practice. What I often see is that individuals drive things forward because of their moral compass, their ethical focus, their passion, their enthusiasm. And then when you leave to go on to another job, it's not been necessarily formally embedded in normal practice. Even if you've shoved it into a volunteer handbook, the new person that comes in will rework and review it. We're not going to really get a chance to talk about embedding. That might be something we come and talk about at a later date, but we will be talking about how we shift from partially excluding to far more inclusive practice. So that's an organisational level. What I now want to do is ask from your perspective around your confidence and competence. So again, we're going to have about 50 seconds for you to present. So if you think about, again, with a typing error, honestly, I don't know what was on yesterday. Where would you reflect your own personal experience? So in terms of how competent you feel around inclusion work. So novice, are you brand new to this piece of work and situation? Beginner, intermediate, advanced, or expert? And what I would say is often people are very modest around this. So please don't be modest. No one knows that you've said expert, and that's fine if you're an expert. So pop it down. Now, the reason this is really important is that certainly for the work from the EDI group is that we do want to look at matching up and marrying up people within HVG to support one another. Don't worry, we're not going to do any matchmaking today, but certainly part of our EDI plan for autumn is to look at seeing how we can get people to buddy up. How can people start to work more effectively together? Okay, so I'm just having a look. Again, fantastic mid-table. I love mid-table because it's far easier to move mid-table up than it is to start with nothing. So this is great stuff. So thank you so much. And please feel satisfied and proud of all the information that you have. I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share those results so you can see what I see. And I've just taken a photograph of that as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing those results and get onto the presentation. Bear with me. Right, so we've got a session basically in 3 parts. I am going to take a moment and give you some information to give you some context and some hints and tips, really just to get you thinking. Then what I'm going to do is stop. I'm going to have another cup of coffee while you go into your breakout rooms and begin to discuss what I've talked about in relation to your professional practice. And essentially I'm going to ask you 3 questions. The first question is, what resonated with you as part of the presentation? The second aspect is, what are you doing in addition? So what else can you share with that immediate group? And then the third thing is, what can HVG do? What can the EDI group do to help you? Once we've done those breakout sessions, we're going to come back and basically share some top-line feedback. It will not be death by feedback, but also it's an opportunity to ask questions of me, but also of the rest of the group, because I certainly know I don't have all of the answers. This is why collective sessions like this are so important. So let me share my slides. Bear with me. So I've had some tech issues today, so I'm having to use a presentation I gave back in February, which isn't specifically targeted for volunteers. So you'll see some language, I'm afraid, that talks about job descriptions, whereas the one that I had written that's on a computer that has just died does talk about volunteer roles. So please just be accepting of those. So, and it's certainly not the 10th of February. So let me just move along. Bear with me. Fantastic. Hopefully, can everybody see that slide deck there? So I'm going to start talking about definitions, and then going to talk about drivers, and then I'm going to give you some hints and tips. And throughout this, we'll then bake into the breakout rooms. So let me just move across. So I want to start with some definitions. And the reason I think it's important to define our terms is it enables you to focus your activity. So if you look at any sort of text about recruitment and selection, they have these definitions. So recruitment is all about attracting a field of candidates. So when we're talking about inclusive recruitment, primarily we're talking about where do we advertise, where do we engage, who do we talk to? It is about casting your net widely. Whereas selection is choosing between those applicants. And again, apologies for that terminology, but making that decision around, with the volunteer applicant, around where might be the best volunteer role for them within the organisation and on what basis. So recruitment, attracting a field of candidates. Selection is making a decision between them, and then also thinking about where they might go within your organisation. There are lots of different definitions of equality, diversity and inclusion. These are the Museums Association's ones. And the reason I've highlighted our own definitions of equality, diversity, inclusion is that your organisation may well define those differently for themselves as well. So as part of that, what I would be suggesting is going back to your organisation. If you've got an equal opportunities policy, if you've got an inclusion policy, a respect and dignity policy, they come with a whole variety of different titles. Have a look at how your organisation has defined equality, diversity and inclusion. Because often the starting point is, I just need to scroll down. Bear with me. The starting point often is around a legislative requirement. Literally everything that could possibly be happening today. If you can see on screen, I now have a cat that seems to be rather interested in me. Never been interested in me before, but is really interested in me today. So bear with me. I'm just going to move some of my slides. So often when we talk about equality, diversity, inclusion, the starting point is the legally protected characteristics, of which there are 9. Again, I'm not going to list them. What we've done in the Museums Association, which again might be something that your own organisation does, is we've added to that. So we've said, in addition to those legally protected characteristics, what we are very much focused on are aspects of social economic status, class. We also include in our definition the concept of urban and rural. I think that's really important when we're looking at volunteer recruitment and selection, because there are additional challenges from a rural perspective in attracting and supporting volunteers. We also look at different characteristics in terms of extroversion and introversion. What does that mean for the recruitment and selection process? So for example, guess what? Extroverts always perform far better at interview than introverts. It's extrovert biased. So, so thinking about how you define equality and inclusion and those characteristics is a really important point. And you may well find that within your own organisation, particular underrepresented audiences or local audiences or communities have been identified as key groups to engage with. And thus, they then form perhaps part of your focus for volunteer attracting and recruitment. What's important to note is that these characteristics will impact and are impacted on all stages of the process of attracting volunteers. There's also something to note that there is a relationship between them as well, insofar as the concept of intersectionality. And what we mean by intersectionality is that we're belonging to a single group and belonging to another group amplifies potentially the disadvantage, if that makes sense. Another term for intersectionality is the concept of multiple discrimination, which basically means you're getting the discrimination or the exclusion layered on top of you to a greater degree. The reason it's important to understand how you define it is because that basically enables you to think about what your current profile is, what your current volunteer profile is. because understanding your current volunteer profile, again, may enable you to think far more targetedly from a positive action perspective about how you would look to attract particular groups of individuals that aren't currently reflected in your volunteer profile. So that's why it's important, one, to know how you define those terms. Secondly, to identify what are the characteristics that are important, and as part of that, being able to measure those characteristics. So whether you use a monitoring form on first application, whether you use, 1 second, the door is open and a cat. It is one of those inclusive days, people. So what's really important to think about is, where do you measure this as well? And also the capacity you have to measure this. I was on a fantastic call with Caroline Chestnut yesterday, where we were talking about the concept of data and the concept of storing data and the capacity we have to have about taking that information and where do we put it and how often do we go back. However, understanding our volunteer profile can really help us make a difference in terms of inclusive recruitment and selection. Because understanding that profile and taking measurements at particular points and basically answer that last question at the bottom: at which point in the process does exclusion occur? Okay, so is it because no one even applies? Because you know what, the only people you've talked to about the vacancies are the small pool of cloned volunteers that work in your own organisation, that only talk to people that look like and speak like and do like them. So understanding where the drop-off is really, really important. Yeah, I'm just going to carry on scrolling. So that's really sort of my context. Just in terms of drivers, and I'm literally going to canter through this, drivers, and the reason I think it's important to think about drivers is because it may enable you to think about when you measure things, think about how you influence in your organisation. So there is a legal compliance perspective in terms of our Equality Act. What we do know, so I'm just going to again scroll across, you know, so the legislation's there, Equality Act 2010. What we also know that the more diverse an organisation, the better business outcomes there are. There's lots of research that talks about this. And there's also obviously information with regard to, sorry, I'm just having to move things on my screen. What you might find, depending on where the volunteer emphasis is, it could come from funding compliance. We already talked about ethics at the end of March, so there's an ethical requirement around involvement and participation. And again, depending on your organisation's vision and values, what you might well find is that there is a social justice perspective, you know, so not only sort of an ethical approach, but a real moral approach around involving in different individuals. So what does that mean? What can you do? Let me give you some more information. And I'm scrolling down. I'm working from a PDF handout. Joyful rather than a presentation, so please be patient. Brilliant. Let me just go back up a tiny bit. And then scroll over. So I'm now just going to give you some handy hints and tips, which I'm sure you already have been doing, which is why it's important to carry on thinking. Bear with me. Thinking about it. Thank you for being very patient. Strangely, fine, okay, nearly there. Fantastic. Okay, so in terms of inclusive recruitment, and we're talking about this attraction of a field of applicants, is mapping that process. So, and this should be done frequently. So work out the whole process for your volunteer engagement and look wherever possible around evidence of bottlenecks or barriers. So I've already talked about measuring those, i.e. if this number of people apply, how many people actually get through to the next stage, or how many people register an interest or visit your website, how many people then come along down the line. But also talk to the people that are there, identify from their experience of going for any sort of orientation event, or open day, coach, recruitment and selection. Ask people their feedback to see whether there are any barriers. Were there barriers in the language that you used? So in the role descriptions you have, were you using jargon or loaded words? You know, did you use the word energetic that could be seen to be ableist? Are you using the word dynamic that could be seen to be ageist? What are the loaded words that you're using that mean that individuals may look at a role description or may look at an advert and think, this isn't for me? How can you make the language as appealing and meaningful for them? And again, depending on whether you are looking for particular requirements, and I know every organisation adopts a different approach to volunteering. You know, there's a spectrum, isn't there, between sort of organisations saying this is what we want, and there being a far more emergent approach about bespoking volunteer opportunities. And you guys here might be at any point in that spectrum. But again, just think about what it is you're asking for. Look where you advertise. How are you casting your net most widely? And if there is something around identifying and targeting particular groups or particular areas of your community, how can you do that? So is it about using community notice boards? Is it about using, you know, the local Facebook billboard? Is it about, you know, church notice boards? Is it about utilising the existing network that you have? So that there's something called a snowball technique. I don't know if you've heard about this. That's the technical terminology, whereby which you highlight with somebody. Say, for example, you wanted to get a woman in a denim jacket with red lips and glasses, and you wanted more of me. You would email me, because the likelihood is that, guess what? I know more of me. It might well be the where you think. So think about how you can utilize the people that are already in your group and use this snowball technique. And another way of doing that might also be about adopting or approaching particular small groups or networks, community groups, and then utilizing their network to extend your reach. So whenever I do research, if I say to somebody, oh, this is what I'd love to get your views on this, but also please forward this to anybody you know. So how can you do this more effectively? Now, I appreciate before I've been talking quite a bit about digital. We have to remember there is issues around digital poverty, digital exclusion, lack of digital literacy. So again, thinking about not always adopting the same approach all of the time. The window for advertising is really important. So how long are you giving it? Because there could well be a celebration happening. So for example, there might be Easter, or in Ramadan at the moment. What does that mean for different individuals' abilities to invest effort and time and resource and energy to make connections, to email, to find out more information? So just making sure it's long enough, making sure that it doesn't disclude as a function of often religious holidays and celebrations. You know, it could be, you know, as minimal as thinking around, you know, am I going to be doing an open day on a Friday afternoon when it's dark in the winter? Who's that going to exclude? So having those questions around what are those celebrations? Are there any days of the week that are better or worse for people? Are there better times of the day, better or worse for people? Throughout all of this, you should be thinking, who am I potentially excluding? And I think a really good example of that for me, that I think we might have all seen recently, was the obviously the recent departure of Prince Philip. I don't know if you've seen all the narrative about National Railway inquiries. They changed everything from blue to grey as a sign of respect, without thinking about the huge implications that has in terms of visual impairments. So within all of this, also thinking about, are you putting in any additional help and support to enable people to apply? So if you know that you want to attract a particular group because you it makes sense for your collection, it makes sense for your local communities, all of those things, what else can you do to put in place to help them? Can you help them with Q&As? Can you help them with a very light touch form? I mean, we've not even talked about paperwork and the extent to which so often when we think volunteering, HR individuals think, oh yes, we'll just literally take that document for paid employees and we'll scrub out employee and put volunteering. So there are so many ways in which we can, because we're not governed by the employment legislation component, to look at how we can change the content of applications, etc. Final, or nearly final slide for me, and then we'll break out. And this is really about choosing between them. So again, I sort of morphed into that. So look at the support you can provide. Are there orientation sessions? If you work in an organisation that has walls and seems to be opaque, is it a huge shocker that people aren't going to want to work and volunteer with you? How can you make that more transparent? How can you open those windows? How can you support people in terms of their application process, their expression of interest, whatever your approach is? Depending on what you do, think about, are there any potential biases? Now, I've already talked about the concept of interviews being far more extrovert bias than other aspects. So do think about what it is you can put in place. And just because you've always done it this way, and just because that's how they do it for employees, doesn't mean you have to do it this way. I know there's been lots of discussion recently about the need to do disclosure checks and CBR checks about the extent to which that's slowing this down and putting people off from applying. So challenging those things is important. As part of all of this, there is something around training those individuals that will be having these conversations to make sure they're not as biased. So do they know what they need to do? Are they clear about the legislation? Do they know what they should be looking for? And is there any either implicit bias or explicit prejudice and discrimination taking in place? In terms of all of this, whether it is to actually participate in volunteering or to participate in any of the run up towards this, how can you help that? Paying expenses can be really great. We would hope that would be a minimum, but that's not always the case. We're not all flush organisations, but that certainly goes a huge way to supporting these aspects. Digital approaches can be really, really helpful. It can help people that perhaps have social anxiety. It can help people that perhaps, haven't got the money or the resource to travel somewhere, or they don't have the suit that they might be expected to. So again, talking really broadly. And there is something about, objective decision making, and this probably is far more associated with selection, so I do apologise here. But, actually, how do we make sure that we are meeting the needs of the volunteer as well as the needs of the organisation, and knowing what that looks like without prejudice? So thinking about all of these, how do you help those individuals that want to come and volunteer with you? How can you make sure that they are successful? So I'm going to stop sharing this slide and hand over to Will, who's going to put you all into breakout rooms. But just to reiterate the 3 questions. The one is, was there anything with that presentation that resonated with you? 2, what else are you doing that's fantastic that your breakout room can hear about, and then we can all hear about when we come back as a big group? And then thirdly, what else do you need from us? What would be helpful? Can we get you more resources? Can we run more sessions like this? What would be helpful to enable you to move from partially inclusive to embedded inclusive, or novice to expert? So those are the things I want you to talk about. And you're going to have 15 minutes. And I am going to be quiet. And I'm going to hand over to Will to put everybody into breakout rooms. I'll see you in 15 minutes time.